Okay, so in this video, we're going to make a quick API. So for those who don't know, an API is, I'll use an example. So imagine marketing.com. On this website, I have 1 million users signed up, and I would like to access their information, but I want to access it from downloadmycode.com. So obviously this website doesn't have access to the database from my other website. So we make an API so that we can easily pass the information across, and I can use it over here as well. So basically there are some prerequisites I've made already on my server. You can see here an index.php file and an includes file. All that's in here is an init.php file, which we haven't written yet, but it's going to act as our connection to a database. I've also created a database already. So what we need is an API key. So APIs do have keys, but for basic security. So I don't want anyone to be able to access the information unless they have an API key from me to say that it's okay. So I've generated this API key and stored it in a database in a table called API keys. Is valid is set to 1, it's still valid, and the date generated is today at around 11 a.m. And then I've also created a users database. So as this is all just an example, I've created one user and it's me, user ID 12345, my first and last name, a test email address, and then the date that I registered, which also happens to be yesterday. And we're going to use these two tables that you could recreate to make our API work. So I've opened the files over here. So I've got index.php, which is linked to marketing.com/API right now. So you can see, like, if I open some PHP tags, echo hello, you can see that when I make the change on the server and it goes through, you can refresh the page and it says hello. So what we're going to do with this page is, the way that the API is going to work is that you pass in some variables through the URL. So right now, you might be familiar with PHP's get super global, which means that you can pass things into the URL and use them in the document itself. So the way you write this is, we need to first think about what variables we need. So let's write that. What variables we need our user ID. We need to know which user that the API request would like information on, so that we get user ID. And then we also need the API key to make sure that they're allowed to make requests to our database. So you do get get API key. This will all make sense in a few seconds if it doesn't already. And then also we want to know what information do they want. Do they want all the information on the user? Do they want only the first name? Because you can see here we've got it separated into the separate fields. So we need to do the same thing for the fields. Get fields. Okay, so right now we don't actually have any of these set in the URL. So we're going to go ahead and do that first. But what we're going to do is we're going to emulate what if someone makes a request and they haven't, for example, provided an API key. So we're going to check that. We're going to make sure they've written an API key in the URL before we let them have access to our database. So we're going to say if not set. So if not is set, API key. So if the API key isn't in the URL, what do we do? So what I want to do now is I'm going to echo to the screen, and I'm going to Json encode it, because these requests won't be necessarily typed into a browser. No one's going to go to this URL in a browser necessarily. What they will do, though, is on their website or on my other website, for example, I will run a curl, what's called a curl request in PHP, which allows me to pull information from a URL. So I need to make sure that they've got the correct access, and I'm going to Json encode it just in case the guy who's on the receiving end of the information isn't using PHP. Json is a universally accepted language and can be converted into an array from whatever programming language the guy on the receiving end is using. So I'm going to Json encode, and I'm going to make an array, and it's going to inside the array it's going to have an error basically. So the way we distinguish between our errors is we probably have an error code, and this error code can just be 1, for example. It doesn't really make any sense. You probably heard of error codes like 404 for not found, things like that, but you can make your own error codes. And then the message, you got to bring back a message with it, and the message in this case is probably going to say API key is required. Okay, so now when we save this and we run, we can see that API key is required because I haven't provided one. So that's correct. This is all working correctly so far. As you can see here also, all the API keys this is 100 characters long, just so that it can't be guessed, and it makes it kind of more secure. So there's no, what we need to do now is, okay, they provided an API key, but what if the API key is 1. See, we don't get that error anymore. It treats it like it's an appropriate, acceptable API key, and it isn't, because we know API keys have to be 100 characters long. So what we do now is we say if string length strlen of API key does not equal 100. So if it's not 100 characters long, we know it's not a valid API key. Also, we should probably die after this. We don't want to run the rest of the code if there's already an error. We want to let them address the error first. So we can copy this down and say error code can now be 2, and then API key is invalid now. So, okay. So now if I save this, we now get another error saying API key is invalid. And if I remove this altogether, you can see we get API key is required, API key is invalid. So we've got a couple of errors working so far. Okay, so what if they do have a 100 character API key? Then that would come through as true when it isn't. So what we need to do now is we need to include our database file. We need to check the database. Now that we know it's a valid length and it is set, they've provided us an API key and it's the right length. What we need to do now is check to make sure that it's in our database as a still valid API key. So the way we do that is I'm going to include right now server document root, and then this is going to go to /API, which is the folder we're in, as you can see over here, and then includes /init.php. And then I'm going to, you can see that I've already made this here. As you can see, includes is here, and then inside that is init.php. And what we need to do now is we need to establish a connection to our database. So your database will be different to mine probably. I'm using some free hosting for this. But I'm going to quickly sort of copy and paste in my database information. So you would just connect to your database, but make sure that the variable name that it's assigned to is con. There's a million tutorials on how to connect to your database from YouTube, so this is pretty easy to do. And then just make it an init.php file and make the variable that your database is assigned to called CONN. Also, what I've done is I've set the time zone to Europe London, which is what my time zone is, and I've added a variable in here called date, which is just set to today's date and time, and the year first, and the month, then the date, and then the hours, minutes, and seconds. And that's going to be used in here to make sure that the API key is valid to this day. So now that we've included the database, we can check against our the API keys table to make sure that the API key they've given us is allowed. Basically, it's still valid, because you see here we have the is valid field column. That means that if each API key is valid for 1 week. So you can see it was generated yesterday, so there's 6 days left. So we can compare it against today's date and make sure that it's still sort of a valid key. And if it's not a valid key, we can change is valid to 0, and then this API key is no longer valid anymore. So first what we're going to do is we're going to say q equals con, because obviously that's what we called our database, and we're going to query the database and say select date generated, which is this field over here, from API keys, where API key, which is the column name, as you can see here, the long 100-digit thing, equals API key, which is our variable name that we've assigned up here to whatever the user puts in the URL. But also we want to say and is underscore valid equals true. So what we're looking for now is we're looking for a field that has this exact API key in, the one that the user's typed into the URL, but also it's still valid. As right now, this one's set to 1, so this is a valid API key. Okay, so now what we do is we say if q num rows, so if the number of rows returned equals 0, then we can copy up this return code here, and we can say change the error code to 3 this time, and say what we'd say now is API key is invalid still, basically, because it's not a valid API key anymore still. We've checked the database and it hasn't returned enough results, it hasn't returned 1 result, so that means that the API key that you've given us, even though it's 100 characters long and even though that you have provided us with one, it's not actually a valid API key. So now we can carry on. So we know that because we've written die here, we know that if the code gets to this point, then it is a valid API key. So we know that it's in the database at least. But what we need to do now is, what if the API key has gone invalid since our database last checked? So what we can do now is we can say, I want to say date generated equals, then do Q, fetch an associative array, date generated, and then we can say, let's not do date generated, let's do degenerated for short, and then say d expires, and then we know the date that this expires because it is the date that it was generated plus 7 days, because we know that every API key lasts for a week. But what we're going to do is we're going to convert it to Unix time, and you'll see why we're going to do this in a sec. So we use PHP's str2 time, and then say degenerated, and then you can do dot and append plus 7 days. So what this does is says, get the date that it was generated, add 7 days to it. So now that's the date that was generated and the date that it expires. And now we're going to do d today, which is the date today. And that's going to be str to time, string to time, the date that we've written in the current date, basically. And now what we can do is we can compare some of these against each other to see if that a week's gone by since the API key was generated. So what we can do is we can say if the date today is greater than or equal to the date that the API key expires, this means that the API key is expired since it was last checked. So what we can do now is we can say con query update API keys, which is the table name, set is valid equals 0 where API key equals API key. So what this does now is it will check and make sure, and if it's out of date, if I generated this key more than a week ago, it's now an invalid key. It will change the is valid here to a 0, and that means that the user won't be able to use the key anymore. This is just how we make sure that user data is protected. Each key is for a week, and then you can give them a new key, and then you can revoke this at any time just by changing is valid to 0. And the system will automatically now change is valid to 0 if the key has been out for longer than a week. Okay. So now moving on, what we can do now is we need to check that the user ID, that they've given us a user ID. So this one's simple. We can say if, actually what we can do is we can copy and paste the one from the API key. So we say if is set user ID. If they haven't given us a user ID, then we can return error code 5 and say user ID is required. So now let's see what we can get up to. Let's save all of this, go back in. Okay, so our API key is still invalid. So what I'll do is I'll pretend to be a customer. I have an active API key. I'm going to paste that into the URL, press enter, and let's see what it says. Okay, user ID is required. So it's acknowledged that we haven't actually given it a user ID. The system doesn't know what data to return because it doesn't know what user we want. So what we can do now is we can check if okay, so okay, so now that we're past this, once we get past this, because again we've written die, we know that if we get to this point that the user ID is perfectly valid, but now we need to check if the user exists in a database. So we can define Q again, set it equal to con query select let's see, so we can select all from users where user ID equals user ID. And now again we can say if q num rows equals 0, then we can copy and paste the error code again because we know that the user isn't in our database. We can change the error code to number 6 and we can say user doesn't exist. So now we know the user doesn't exist in our database. So okay, let's try that again. We can run it again. User ID is required. We still haven't given it one, so let's go all the way to the end of our URL and append the user ID. So user ID equals 1. Okay, user doesn't exist because there's no user in our database that has the ID of 1. We only have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I paste this in, we shouldn't get any error messages. Let's go right back to the end, paste it in, enter, and we didn't get any error messages. That means that our code has acknowledged that there are no errors so far, but we also haven't told it what information to return. So as we carry on further down this, onto line 76, what we can do now is, the reason up here we defined fields is because, like I say, we have, user ID, first name, last name, email. What does the user want? So we can say if they haven't defined a field, if not is set fields, then that probably means they just want all the information on that user. So what we can do is echo Json encode, and then just queue from up here. See where we selected everything from the database. So what we do now is if we save that and we go back into here, we can see that, we can see that it's returned a false value, and that's because we aren't returning the array, we're returning the query. So all we've got to do is tack on fetch associative array and then save it again. And when we save that, see we get user ID 12345, first name Mark, last name Hinton, email address, day registered, that all gets returned. But what if they don't want all of the information? And bear in mind, your user database might be much bigger than mine. You might have 1,000 columns of information about each user, so it might take a little bit longer. What if they only want like the first name, for example? So there are a number of things we can do. So we can now die after this because the information that they want's already been returned. And now we know that if we get to line 81, then the request is looking for particular information on a user. So what we can do now is we say fields equals explode, and the limiter will be a comma, and the string will be the fields value itself. And what this is in the URL, we can type things like this. We can say fields equals, we might want the first name, comma, last name, first name and email maybe. I'd say first name, email address. They don't want all the information, they just want first name and email address. So this is how we do this. But what if the user types a field that we don't know about? What if they type age, but we don't have that, we don't have age? What we can do is we can create an array of allowed field names and set that to an array value. And then in here we can have name, first name, last name, email address, and registration date. And you notice that all of these names correspond perfectly to the way it's written in here. You see, these are the same. And now what we can do is we will say we'll define a user variable that we're going to return at the end. But what we're going to do now is say for each fields as field. So for every single field they've typed, and bear in mind we're separating by comma, so if they've typed name, comma, first name, it will run the loop twice, once for the word name, once for the word first name. And this is pretty easy. So what we can do now is say if it's not in the array, field allowed. So basically what this is saying is if what they've asked for isn't in our allowed field names, like we don't have that information, then what we can do is say we can return our error from before, and we'll say this. So the error code is 7, and we'll say the field, and then input the field name doesn't exist. So you'll see this now in action. So I'll do this now. Save this, go to the end, and I'll ask for a field name that we don't have, like age. And it'll say message 7, field name age doesn't exist. So they'll get an error if they ask for information that we don't have. Now, the next thing we can do is, because we've died again here, we know that, 1 second, let me go back to the code. We know that because we're dying here, we know that if it gets to this point, actually we won't die, we want to continue because we want to loop. So if we get to here, if the code gets to this point, then we know that the field name does exist. But you'll notice here we've got a field called name, but we don't actually have that in our database. And the way we're going to do this is we might want the user's full name, but we haven't actually stored their full name in the database. We've stored first and last in separate fields. So we're going to say if field equals name, then user, which is up here, what we defined the array up here, user field equals q first name, tack on a space, and then q last name. And then what this does is it just makes user set field, you'll notice up here, is whatever the field is. So for example, name, it will say user name equals first name plus last name. And you'll see this now. Oh, I save it. Okay, you haven't seen that. Interesting. Oh, it's because we haven't returned a user variable yet. Okay, and then we'll continue after this as well. Oh, I've just noticed if there is an error, we do want to die up here, not continue. We don't want to carry on if there's an error. We want to stop them in the tracks. So down here, you can say continue. Whoops. Close the code there. Okay, so continue. And now we know if it gets to here, then it isn't, they're not asking for the names. They might be asking for the first name, last name, or whatever separately. So we can type user field equals q field. And all this does is correspond, because we've named these exactly the same as they are in our database, we can just pull that individually from the query that we made before. And then this should just work. And now the only thing left is to print. Okay, maybe we need to close out of one. And let's see where we are with our brackets. That's in the for each loop. Let's get out of that. And now say print R. We want to print the screen. Json encode. And then our user database variable. Okay, so save this. Okay, so we cannot use object MSI result as an array in line 111. So let's see what we've done. User field equals q field. Let's see what the issue is. I see, okay. So what we can do is we can copy this down here. And then we can change q to fetch associative array. And now we save it. You can see it's returned, because we're over here, we've asked for first name and email address. You can see first name is Mark, email address equals mark@gmail.com. And if I tack on, for example, name, you'll now be able to see it also adds my full name, which we programmed that to do earlier. And you can request this in any order. So we can say name, email address, and it returns my full name and my email address. And then this means that this URL can be requested from, for example, downloadmycode.com. And I'll be able to pull information from this website onto this website and use this sort of to populate pages and to validate logins and things like that. But that's basically like all the code that you'll need. Obviously, you might have a table with 1 million users in it, and that'll be amazing. This will work really well if you need to pass on information to partners, for example, or if you have another website. For example, Google do this with Google Drive and Google Docs and Google and Gmail and stuff. Because it's all across different subdomains, they need access to all of this information. So this is what Google will do. You'll also know that if you've ever used Facebook, and sometimes it asks for your permission for certain apps, the permission that the apps get is to certain data, and they get an API key the same as what we've generated, and they're allowed to request your Facebook information in the same way that we're requesting my user information. But I hope this has been useful. Don't forget to leave a comment. Let me know if this is explained clearly enough, if you think I should do it again. All the code files will be in the description and available on downloadmycode.com, which is my website for just uploading code files. Just thanks for watching this video. Hope it's been helpful. Leave a like, and I hope to see you back on this channel again for the next one.